welcome Fred Baker. He's from Cisco Systems. He's a fellow at Cisco Systems. He's past chair of the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the sort of international body that writes all the standards for the way the internet works, is the sort of high level of it. And I've known Fred for a long time. He was gracious enough a long time ago to sort of engage a clueless grad student in discussion. So I'm happy he's here, and I'm looking forward to a good talk. Fred?
Thank you. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of one of the hot topics in the industry right now. The internet is something that is perpetually going through one transition or another. Since 1992, maybe every 2 to 3 years, we've had completely different applications, or new applications coming out and changing the characteristics of traffic on the network and changing the user demographic profile. When I first started using the internet, if you wanted to download a file, you typed in FTP something, and if you wanted to do mail, you typed in MAIL. And summer of 1992, we were looking at what we at the time called the NSF-T1 backbone. We were in the process of going to T3. And looking at the traffic on there, and over the period of a summer, the behavior of traffic changed from TCP sessions of 200, 300, 400 packets each way, running applications like FTP and network news. And all of a sudden, there was this application that used port number 80 and had sessions that went at, they were very small, maybe 10 packets each way. And overnight, the network changed from something that some of my customers used and some of my customers used other things to a network that my mother could use and would use to send email to my sons, who at the time were very small. And of course, she sent email to my sons because she found that they would reply to them. Well, so we're coming up in the next 4 or 5 years to several different transitions that are happening in the network completely asynchronously. And so I want to talk about some of those transitions, kind of give you a view of what we expect to see coming in the next few years, and specifically one related to the addressing in the internet and therefore the root protocol that we use. Now, I used a picture here. I took this picture from the front door of my home. This last summer, you may have heard on the news about the Gap Fire out on the West Coast. Well, the Gap Fire came to my home, came within about a half a mile of my home. And I use that because a lot of the people that talk about IPv6 and talk about the transitions that we're coming up to make it sound like the place is about to burn down. And, well, the place isn't about to burn down, but there are some things that we need to think fairly carefully about as an industry. So I'll be talking about some of those issues. Before we go into it too far, forward, there we go. Let me talk for a moment about the initial development of IPv6 and my own involvement in it. And I want to say this as much as anything because I'm likely to come off as though, this is the way of the future and everybody has to jump on my bandwagon. And I want to tell you that that has not been my historical position. In 1992, Frank Skolensky was looking at the rate at which we allocated IPv4 addresses and figured out that if we continued on the way we were going to allocate the last one around the end of 1993. And when he said that, there was a lot of people that got very excited and, let's not do that. So we changed the way we allocated addresses. We deployed a technology we called classless interdomain routing, which is a different way of grouping and describing prefixes. We deployed a technology which we call network address translation, which allowed us to hide many systems behind a small number of addresses. And we also started working on a next generation protocol saying, not right away, many years down the road, sooner or later, we are going to have a next generation protocol, so let's start thinking about it. We ran a solicitation. We got 4 different proposals, and the 4 proposals were eventually whittled down to 1, which became what we call IPv6. But just looking at the thinking, looking at the thought processes, and looking at all the things that were going on at that time, I, as chair of the IETF, found myself in a kind of an interesting position. Long term, we needed more IP addresses. I saw value in a routing architecture that was being discussed by Noel Chiappa that tried to change routing to be, instead of between interfaces, which is the way internet routing works today, to put it between transport endpoints, between systems, if you will. And then separate between the names that we used for those things and the addresses that we used to identify the interfaces. And saw the value of the things that we were doing in terms of reclassifying the address space, but saw dangers as well. The network address translator, for example, works very easily for a client-server application. Not all applications are client-server. My telephone does voice on IP. That's not a client-server application. It's a peer-to-peer application. So it didn't work real well for applications that weren't client-server. So I kind of looked at the whole thing and said, the jury's still out. We're going to have to figure things out and do a lot of work before we're ready to say, this is the horse we want to ride, this is the direction we want to go. So I was the chair until 2001. In a couple of years succeeding, I was on the Internet Architecture Board and looking in a couple of other places, and looked at and talked with different industry bodies. For example, the 3GPP Forum, which designs GSM telephones, and observed them saying, I can't do what I need to do with IPv4. One in particular was Cernet, which is the Chinese counterpart to Internet 2. Xing Li, the guy who runs Cernet, or the principal mind behind it, wanted to bring the entire Chinese university system onto the Internet. Understand that China has 1.3 billion people that they admit to, and probably quite a few more. And the university system is roughly students, faculty, administration people, all people put together that are in the university system plus the secondary schools, is roughly 320 million people, which is to say roughly comparable in population to the continent of North America. And so Xing Li went to APNIC and said, well, okay, Aaron for North America manages 77 what we call /8s, groups of 16 million addresses. And 77 is enough for North America. I can be really frugal. I can be really smart. I can do this for the Chinese university system with only 72 /8s. Could you please give me the entire remaining IPv4 address space so that I can bring the Chinese university system online? And APNIC made a very predictable response. And Xing Li said, I can't do it in IPv4. I have to go to the next step. So he is now running Cernet 2, which is an IPv6 only network. And so looking at the people that are kind of saying, well, it'll work well enough for my purposes, I've kind of said, okay, great. I have to put my shoulder to the wheel. I've been working pretty much my career since 1988 or 1987 in the internet space and working to make IPv4, which existed before that, was defined in 1981, make it work well for the applications and the people that use it. And I expect I'll probably need to do the same with IPv6. So fine, it's time to get started, think about deployment, and make those things happen. Why are we looking at IPv6? Why do we think that that's an important thing? Basically, it addresses a present need for more addresses in the internet, and a present issue with the complexities of the network in terms of operating it with IPv4. And it gives us room to work on remaining issues, of which there are a lot of remaining issues. Now, why? Let me talk a little bit about economics and a little bit about geography. Last November, Vodafone issued their every 6-month statement of what their numbers were. They said, you know, we made however much money we made. And Vodafone, of course, does it on telephones. Basically, second generation, third generation telephony. And so this was a report that was issued by one of the report houses that was analyzing their numbers and trying to figure out where the movement in their numbers was. Now, when Vodafone issued their numbers, they said, we made a lot more money. Telephones are good. Buy telephones. And this report said, well, actually, the increase in revenue due to voice was 7%. If you want to attribute it to telephones, that's not this, okay? Telephones are not driving it. And by the way, the mobile telephone vendors like to talk about SMS traffic, people text messaging. And by the way, if you ever want to meet a fast typist, go to Japan and watch a teenage girl with her telephone. They are quick, okay? But SMS revenue grew a grand total of 9%. What was driving Vodafone's numbers was over-the-top traffic. Google, Facebook, MySpace, YouTube. The different applications that, by the way, Vodafone would really like to make go away because they don't pay money inside their walled garden. Okay? But it was over-the-top revenue, or over-the-top applications that were driving the revenue. And so this report concluded that if the operators really want to figure out how to make a lot of money, they need to figure out how to harness over-the-top applications as a business driver and convince people that they want to buy telephones for the purpose of getting to over-top applications. Another report, okay, so what this tells us, one of the transitions that we're looking at, we have roughly 1 million computers in the world. We have roughly 3 million telephones. But increasingly, the telephone is a handset or an instrument of choice to gain access to the internet and a way to gain access to content. Okay, so this becomes the next generation kind of thing that you want to target your application to. How can I make it work well on that size of screen? That's a scary thought. But okay. Now, this is a report that came out of Nemertes Research, which is a market research firm in New York, and was also published just last November. Jana was looking at, Jana Till Johnson is a woman I've known for probably 20 years, and her training is as a physicist, but she's been a data communications editor. She's been a market research analyst. She now owns her own market research company. For her, in looking at market research and trying to figure out where markets are going, it comes back to equations. She's a physicist, and she says, okay, how can I describe this mathematically and figure out where things are going? The kind of analysis that she did is actually the basis for Moore's discussion of the Moore's law. He said, I observe that every 18 months, the amount of transistors that we can put on a piece of silicon doubles, and so with the same piece of silicon or the same size piece of silicon, I can do twice as many things. And he didn't know how the different transitions would happen to make that continue to happen, but his fundamental observation was people figure it out. That's what we do. And so in terms of planning for future markets, we need to think in terms of what we now call Moore's Law kinds of development in silicon. And she was trying to do the same kind of an analysis here and say, so in data communications, what Moore's Law equivalent kind of a thing can I do? And so she built equations that described the growths of markets from 1990 to 1995, and based on that predicted 1996, played until her equations correctly described that. Then, given that, made it predict 1997, played with the equations until she got that to happen, and finally worked up a set of equations that in fact described the markets from 1990 until now. And then she said, okay, so what's happening in the next few years based on those equations? No matter what she did to them, she wound up with a hockey stick. She wound up saying that the growth in bandwidth utilization, both in growth in bandwidth demand in our industry, don't know how this is going to happen, don't know why, but the growth is likely to dramatically increase over the next few years. And then she stepped back and said, okay, so if that's what my equations tell me, how can I support that empirically? What would that correlate to? And she made an interesting observation. When I was little, computers filled a room. Okay? The first computer that I ever worked with was at NASA Lewis Research Center, now NASA Glenn, over on the other side of town. And it was an IBM 7094, and it filled a room roughly this size. And next door to it, there was a System 360 Model 67, which filled a much bigger room. And was huge. And so now, you know, we have computers that we can carry around, and by the way, are much more powerful than those computers. And when I first started using this kind of thing to dial into my work, I used what was at the time considered a very high-speed computer communication interface, which was a 9.6 kilobit modem. Nowadays, you're just kind of not very bright if you can't get a broadband connection that's at least a megabit. You know, our bandwidths have gone up dramatically. And so people like you, well, not you that are from other countries, but you that are from here, basically have never lived in a world where broadband capabilities weren't kind of pervasive, normal. You don't know what we can't do, and you proceed to do it anyway. And so now, let me give you an example, a toy that is being developed in a research lab at MIT called a Connectable. And what this toy is, it targets 10-year-old girls. And imagine a charm bracelet, okay? You have these little charms that you can hang on your charm bracelet, and they remember your friend, right? So you buy some of these things, and you give them to your friends, and they put them on their charm bracelets. But these charm things have built into them some computing capability, some video capability, and some 802.11 networking capability. So you're able to exchange video and audio with your friends. And by the way, if you've got two friends that don't know each other, you can pull their charms off the charm bracelet, introduce them. You can go down to the mall. Oh, gee, there's a new Barbie. See the new Barbie. You can do all sorts of interesting things. 10-year-old girl never knew that there wasn't enough bandwidth to do that, and so off she goes. Skype. I'm running video on Skype. My telephone on my desk now has video, something that we dreamed about in the 50s when I was a kid, but we're doing normally now. So we have all sorts of applications that are driving video and driving the need for many more components that might have IP addresses on them that might be carried around on the body or part of your car. There might be 140 addresses in your car or found around your home and doing various and sundry things. And what Jana was basically looking at was investment in North America and saying, you know what? based on the investment levels in North America, that next application will probably come from outside of America because America isn't investing properly. Okay, so now you can see that in the next few years, we're looking at some very big changes in the way applications work and in the kinds of instruments that we're going to be using. So now let's look at IPv4 address space. If you look over time, this is starting from January 1995, coming up to 2000, where we had the internet bubble, and the internet didn't grow very rapidly for a while. Look at the growth of IPv4 allocations from the Internet Assigned Number Authority to the regional internet registries. What they've been doing is growing roughly exponentially since then, to a point where we're actually going to allocate from the Internet Assigned Number Authority the last IPv4 address in the middle of next year. And from the regional internet registries, probably allocate the last address by the end of 2011. That is putting service providers in a fairly interesting position. A month ago, I was in Australia, talked with the CTO of Telstra and talked with 50 of the engineers that work for him. And they were looking at this very hard and saying, okay, so what are we going to do next? I can go into a marketplace for addresses and maybe pay a lot of money. But that's not going to be a stable source of addresses because other people won't have them to sell. So what am I going to do and how am I going to make things happen to continue my business going forward? Now let me give you kind of a picture of the geography of the internet. This is a map from a firm called Telegeography that basically makes maps and market statistical information for telephone companies. And what it shows you here is, of course, you've got Asia here. You've got a number of undersea cables along the eastern Asia coast. You've got undersea cables that cross the Pacific and go down to Australia. You've got something like 80 cables that go between the United States and Europe. You've got a few cables that run down the coast of Africa and across through the Indian Ocean. If you look at where the internet is today, the vast majority of communications are within a domain that I call the Europe, North America, and Eastern Asia fiber corridor. We've got a large amount of bandwidth here, large enough that we very seriously find ourselves talking about, is there really a need for congestion control or any of the things that we've worried about in the internet for the last 30 years? Is there any current need for them? There's so much bandwidth, we're swimming in it. And the thing is that as soon as you step outside of that domain, delays become much longer, bandwidths become much lower, the probability of loss becomes much higher. The behavior of applications in Africa and South America and much of China is still very much the same way as it was in the United States 30 years ago. So broadband internet today is actually in a rather narrow corridor. Now, that's not true of the wealth in the world. This is a picture courtesy NASA. What they did was they took pictures of the Earth at night in the different parts of the world where it was night, and of course picked the pictures that didn't have clouds in them, and then mapped them together, overlaid them to come up with a picture of streetlights. What's a streetlight? Well, it's a place where you can waste money burning electricity at 3 in the morning when nobody's walking down the street. And frankly, if you've got enough money to burn your street lights at 3 in the morning, you probably have enough money for a few other things as well. There's a picture of wealth in the world. So you can find southern Brazil, you can find the eastern United States, you can find California. Western Europe is very well outlined. Middle East, it's pretty obvious. India, I've got Australia down here, Japan, South Korea. Notice the big black hole of North Korea. Taiwan, Hong Kong. Okay, I mean, you can find places on the map and say, there's money there. Okay? This is the same map done by a different person and telling us where IP addresses are. Okay? So now once again, IP addresses, you can find North America really easily. You can find Western Europe. You can find Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia. India, you can kind of almost make out. Fact is, we don't have a lot of IP addresses in India. And the Middle East, well, there are a bunch of dots there. I suppose they're in that location. But the Middle East isn't a place where you find a lot of internet stuff. And, you know, similarly, Africa and South America. Okay? I look at this chart and say, well, gee, what I'd really rather it look like was this. And frankly, I'd rather be able to take the internet into all these other places as well. And so the dark places on here are the places that I say that as a culture, we haven't finished yet. We've got more work to do. And in the internet, we have a lot more work to do. And frankly, it's going to take addresses to do that. So that's why I get worried about addresses. Now, oh, who do you think those girls are? Take a wild guess. Who do you think those girls are? I'm sorry? They're Maasai. So these girls live in western Kenya or Tanzania. They live actually in a town in western Kenya, which the Maasai, which are a semi-nomadic culture, set up a town and put a bunch of schools in it. And said specifically, not only do we want to send our boys there, we want to send our girls there, which is a huge change for that culture. And so they, at the point where I pulled this picture down, which is about a year ago, at that time they were very proud that they now had 3 girls in med school in Chicago. Okay? What are they using for getting their educational content? They're using the internet. Okay? That is coming in across Chunghwa Telecom. Chunghwa Telecom is probably running a 64 kilobit line out and serving the town. And by the way, that will have a lot of losses. Chunghwa Telecom is not what you call the world's most advanced network. Okay? So where does the internet go? Well, it goes a lot of places. But there's a lot of potential there. I just kind of find it exciting. But okay, so this is a slide that I pulled from a talk at the Joint Techs. Had an operator who was saying, I really don't want to deploy IPv6, and here's my reasons why. Okay? And so he said, well, to begin with, I've got nobody asking me for it. I've got 1,000 things to do and room to do 10. Even if it was number 11, it's not high enough on the list for me to go out and do that. I'm not confident in the technology, and I'm worried that it's not ready technically. Okay? These are the issues that he raised for not deploying IPv6. And okay, so I went back to look at it and say, is this true? Where are we at with that? And I wound up describing, oh, this is also his slide. I'm sorry, he had 2 slides. This is his second slide. And so he listed now a number of issues in the routers and in the equipment in the network that he wished were there and felt that were not. And so now I have to ask, do we really buy that? You know, one of his points was, nobody's thought about turning on IPv6, so I'm not going to do it yet. And, well, okay, I haven't thought about moving to Australia. Does that make Australia a bad place to go? I don't think so. And nobody's asking for it. Well, people generally don't ask for things that they don't particularly know about. Let me ask you, what kind of electricity do you think comes into this building? Is this alternating current or direct current? Do you know? It's actually direct current. Almost throughout North America, we use direct current, but we use it in a way that simulates alternating current. Okay? People don't generally ask for something that they don't understand or know the particulars about. They're not going to come in and ask for IPv6. So I wind up looking at it and saying, no, we as technologists, we as the people who are looking forward in the industry have to be thinking about those things and doing the right thing for the industry and not wait for others to ask us for it. And then his comments on features being dated in products, well, that's true. I think any product that you look at, there's something that you wish was different. In this particular product, IPv6 is on by default, but it cannot translate a domain name over an IPv6 connection. It will always do the DNS translation across an IPv4 connection. Okay, that's just how it works. And so yes, there are issues in the equipment and the software. We'd really like to have that. That said, how many of you have a computer that is not on that list? You do? So which one are you using? You using BIOS? You're using a computer that's not on that list? I'm sorry? I'm using Windows XP. Okay. Windows XP actually has IPv6 as well, but you have to turn it on. The technology's there, but you have to turn it on. Windows XP turns out to be really popular. A lot of the people that I talk with in China, I go in with mine that has the alternative logo, and they kind of, we didn't know those still existed. But okay. But it turns out that the technology for most major vendors actually does support the various things. So I think a lot of the discussion about IPv6 from the technology side is working on dated information. Now, where are we at for time? 20 more minutes. Okay. So, so in the IETF, we're looking at the fact that we're going to have to go through a pretty major transition, starting basically a year from now or within the coming year, and asking ourselves, so how are we going to go about doing that? In 1983, the internet ran on a protocol called NCP. And one night we turned it off, and the next morning we turned on IPv4. There were still some systems running NCP after we had done that. But the vast majority of systems in the internet at the time were suddenly running IPv4. We're not going to be able to do that with IPv6. We're not going to kind of wake up one morning and have it all be different. So how are we going to go do that? How are we going to make the businesses stable? How are we going to make communications that are of a critical nature continue to work? Now, this particular picture came from the IETF meeting we had at the end of July in Dublin. We talk about, be really nice to know who it is that flies the black helicopters and actually control the world. We finally saw a black helicopter. So I took a picture of it. This was at a golf course. The people in black helicopters are I think, going out to the golf course. And okay, so we have in the internet community a real change in the conversations going on. 10 years ago, I was among those that said, maybe not. Maybe IPv6, maybe something else. And you know, we've heard from around the world, well, until the US deploys, there's no point in anybody else even thinking about it. The conversations that we hear now are more of an operational nature. I'm using it, the characteristics of the v6 internet are different than the characteristics of the v4 internet. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. And people comparing notes and figuring out how different things apply in different ways. And in the ISPs, Where they used to be telling us, well, that looks like a cost and I don't want to pay it, they're quietly trying this out in trial networks. And at this point, we actually have some ISPs that are IPv6 only, and a number of them that are running parallel networks or one way or another running serious IPv6 technology. But in the conversations, I'm not convinced that everybody's working toward the same goal. For the vendors, for the technologists, what we're looking at is how can I make the internet simpler to run? How can I make it easier to deploy a new application on? How can I preserve the end-to-end principle and make things work better? Okay? The internet quite often, I think, can be compared to running with a stack of plates. We started out with a basic layered model and the communications that we ran on it. And then we added a plate called NAT. And we added a plate which was MPLS. And we added a plate which was filtering in order to get rid of DDoS attacks. We added a plate which was different. We keep adding a plate. We're always running around with a stack of plates, and the stack consistently gets taller. And at some point, that gets really hard, okay? And so we who are trying to design the technology are looking at it and saying, how can I make the entire business of the internet and the applications and the facilities that it runs, how can I make it simpler? How can I make it work better? For many of the operators, they're saying, you know, I already bought a router last year or 12 years ago or whatever it was, and how can I continue running the network with my existing infrastructure? How can I avoid having to spend new money without getting new revenue? And which is a legitimate business question, okay? And the people who tend to be, you know, IPv6 is wonderful, just do it, tend to not really think about this question, not really solve it, okay? So looking at this from a combination of a business and a technological viewpoint, from my perspective, I'd like to maximize the utility of the internet, the flexibility, the ability to deploy new applications, the ability to deploy new services, start new companies, do all the things that we do, and at the same time minimize my long-term costs. And minimizing long-term costs sometimes means that I have to spend in the short term. Every so often, I buy a new car, okay? And the point where I buy a new car is usually at a point where I've cracked up the old one, or it's just requiring so many repairs to keep it running that I've got an ongoing long-term cost of putting lots of parts in the car. And I sit down and I say, you know, I'm going to be a happier person if I sell that car or junk it and buy a new car, which is a huge short-term cost, but long-term, I'm putting less parts in the car, okay? And similarly, what I find myself looking at is, I think the operational and capital costs of the internet can be minimized in the long term at a present cost. So for me, I come down to, I think we need more addresses. We're going to have to run IPv4 and IPv6 in parallel for some period of time. Run both networks in parallel for some period of time. And then at a point where the uptake of v6 has reached a certain point, then we can start saying, we don't need IPv4 anymore. And we can start taking that down. And so at that point, we turn it off. Now, let me talk about what we have thought about in the IETF as a basic transition strategy. What we've quite frankly suggested is that the simplest thing that you can do to deploy v6 is turn it on in your existing IPv4 network. If I have a system such as my laptop, such as both laptops that are up here, that runs both IPv4 and IPv6, and I do the same in my network. And I have an application that only runs on one, or there's a failure somewhere in the network or whatever, the other can be used to support that application, okay? So if I simply bring up v6 in my existing IPv4 network, that gives me the most resilient and the most flexible way to go a step forward. Now, there's several ways to do that. When I say bring it up in your v4 network, that could be taken very literally as just configure it on all the interfaces. And hey, if you want to do that, I'm all for it. That said, NTT Communications and a variety of other networks have done it as an overlay. What they've got is an MPLS network in their core, and then they use that to connect routers around it, and they actually run a v4 network and a v6 network in parallel over that MPLS core, okay? So they have a basic MPLS network with things around the periphery that support v4 and or v6. Chunghwa Telecom has actually built separate cores. What they've done is, for a long time they had a Cisco core. My competitor, Juniper, came in and said the obvious way to do this is buy all of our equipment and build a completely separate network. And they did that, okay? And I don't know that they're wrong. I'm not sure I would have spent that much money, but okay. So that's also a way to do it. You could literally build a separate interior network. But bottom line, from the perspective of your customers and the people who use your network and the networks that you talk to, you want to look as though you're both an IPv4 and an IPv6 network. That's going to be the simplest strategy for moving across. That said, at this point, that's really hard for many ISPs. Reason being, they have to build out new services, and getting the new services require address space to do that. And they haven't necessarily got the v4 address space to put that out in parallel. So they find themselves being pushed to do what CERNET 2 did by choice 5 years ago, deploy a v6 only network. And so the question becomes, how can I enable myself to deploy new services, continuity of business, using a v6 only domain, and enable those people to be able to get content that is in the v4 only domain, and then convince people that are happy with the v4 only domain to move to the v6 only domain. Because ultimately, in order to reduce the operational costs, I'm going to have to turn off v4. And to do that, I'm going to have to convince the Googles of the world and the Yahoos of the world to run in the v6 domain. How do I do that? Okay, so, comment in between. John Curran used to be the chief scientist of BBN Planet, which was back when there were 5 companies that were the core of the internet. He was one of those 5 companies. He was the chief scientist of Genuity, which back when there were 23 companies at the core of the internet, it was one of the 23. Now he is the chair of the board of the American Regional Internet Registry, ARIN, people that hand out IP addresses in North America. And he's the chief technology officer for yet another network, okay? So he came out with an RFC that describes how he would like to see the transition happen. And what he's basically saying to ISPs is that now it's late 2008, so really starting now and going through 2009, he'd like to see the ISPs bringing up IPv4 within and between their networks. And what I will suggest is that they play some pricing games in order to encourage uptake. And then in 2010, so a little over 2 years from now, he suggests, okay, let's go into what we're going to call a transition phase and actively move people from the present network to the next network. And then, in 2012, start turning down the old network. Okay, now to a typical ISP, this is essentially an overnight switch. And pretty aggressive. But coming from the chairman of the board of Aaron, I have to say that this is, that gives it a lot of impetus, okay? So this I buy, this I actually buy. The date 2012 might be 2020, I don't know. We'll see what the date is. But at some point, yes, we go into a post-transition phase, okay? But yeah, we're expecting to see over the next couple of years fairly aggressive, fairly active transition to the next network. So now in the IETF, we're looking very hard at translation technologies then to enable ISPs to deploy this network, piece it out, and make it happen. This is the discussion that I'll be having in Montreal tomorrow and the next day, and which we'll be having in Minneapolis at the IETF meeting in November. Okay, so we have a variety of documents on the table. I've mentioned 5 of them here related to 4 different topics. And by the way, you'll see my name there, so I'm involved in this personally. There are actually quite a few more proposals on the table than this. But let me walk through just to give you a flavor of the different kinds of proposals that are on the table. We're starting out, as we usually do, with a requirements document to just kind of say what is it that we're trying to achieve and what are the involvements. We have 2 working groups working on this together. IPv6 operations, which I chair, and then Behave, which is a working group that got its name from the fact that network address translators misbehave. So those 2 working groups working together, and really with the V6 maintenance working group, and trying to describe the technologies that we're going to require. Okay. Now, one of the proposals that we've had, this came from NTT. NTT kind of said, well, gee, if I look at the network that I have today, what I have are these network address translators in people's homes, and they connect to the Great Wide Internet out there in the ISP. What if I take the concept the next level up, that I put the translator actually within the ISP, which is in point of fact what is done today in India and Russia, Eastern Europe, large parts of the world that have some internet access but don't have wide address deployment. Okay, so they're kind of saying, could I have what they're calling a carrier-grade network address translator? And the answer is yes, we can do that. We've had some interesting experiences of that. For example, China Unicom is the largest voice on IP network in the world. China Unicom has a national voice on IP network in China. And for a long time, that had 3 layers of translation around it to connect the various places together, and was frankly hell to run. It was very difficult to run. And so they finally were able to get more addresses from APNIC. They ripped out the translators and put in v4 addressing throughout, and now they're able to run a stable network. Okay, so have we been able to do it? Yes, we're able to do it. Comcast is doing it today, but it's not easy. It's not particularly the thing that one would like people to do. So Cisco's building this into our products. We expect some of our customers to use it. Actual extension of the IPv4 internet at most a few years. Now, it's not going to last very long. There's a protocol that is largely a Cisco effort called the Location Identity Separation Protocol. They make jokes about lots of irritating parentheses. But so this is basically an overlay network that's intended to improve routing for the ISPs and might or might not help or avoid a transition. So got people looking this kind of a direction. The one that I'm involved with actually has been deployed for the last 2 years between CERNET, which is an IPv4 only network, CERNET 2, which is an IPv6 only network. What it does, this is a depiction of the IPv6 address, so 128 bits of address, and we actually embed an IPv4 address in the middle of the v6 address. So there's a one-to-one mapping between some between v4 addresses and some v6 addresses. So the idea here is that I can take prefixes of that nature and put them on some systems within a v6 only domain, but use general IPv6 addresses for the other systems in the domain. And what that's going to allow me to do is I can translate domain names between the domains and allow now the v6 services to get to services in v4 domains, and also allow systems in the v4 domain to access those mapped addresses within the v6 domain, which means that I have an ability now to move servers from the v4 domain to the v6 domain, which will be necessary to convince people ultimately to move there. So I can continue operations as I would normally within the v4 only and the v6 only domain. I can access the v4 servers, which NatPT and various other existing solutions do. In addition, now I can have v4 servers accessing services within the v6 domain, which allows me to move things on a transition. Okay? This picture was taken in Hangzhou. Okay? So this is another Cisco fellow by the name of Dave Aran. And he's picking tea in China. And, so what does all this have to do with the price of tea in China? Bottom line, we know that there's transitions that happen in the internet all the time. And it's just part of life for those who run the network and for those who build the equipment that the network uses. Those transitions happen from time to time. And the next few years, we're going to have several of them going on at the same time. We're going to be having the IANA and the RIRs running out of IP addresses, IPv4 addresses, in 2010 and 2011, respectively. That will wind up pushing their businesses in interesting ways. They're probably going to do various things, like trade addresses among themselves. You know, I'll give you money, you give me some addresses, I can continue running my business. But in the long term, they will have to make a very serious step to actually switch over to the new network. Like I say, we've got probably a dozen different proposals on the table. I think all of those proposals are going to be used by somebody somewhere for some period of time. In the internet, that's what we do. We come up with all kinds of ideas and we try them all out. I have to say that I think many of them will operationally be difficult, and as a result, they will die. They will stop being used. What the ultimate outcome has to be, it seems like everybody has an opinion and no two of them agree. So it's a matter of pretty much a lot of controversy, and largely a question of what we're willing to pay and when we're willing to pay it. And basically putting off the expenditure winds up costing more money. So that's a double-bladed sword. Okay? But I will argue that the way to get out the other side of it is to start now and to be moving in the direction of the next network and taking us in that direction, and eventually, at whatever the time that the economics justify it, actually turning down the old network. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. Yeah.
I had a quick look at the address allocations for both IPv6 and IPv4 recently, and noticed that there were a tremendous number of allocations for basically Pacific Rim countries, but relatively thin other places, though there were, some and very little in North America. My question is, how much of the active internet world right now is opaque to IPv4? That is, we can't see them. They can maybe see us, but we can't see them. And does it make a difference? And why isn't this brought up in talks like you've made? Because I've never heard anybody talking about IPv4, IPv6 mention the fact that we can't see those guys.
Well, actually, that does come up from time to time. And the question becomes, in what way do you want to see them? In terms of their domain names showing up, in terms of being able to ping their addresses, or whatever else.
I'd like to be able to talk to them or do business with them. The fact is I cannot in this present situation because there's no way for me to get to them. In the opposite, they could get to me, I suppose, say read my webpage, but
yeah. And so what they wind up doing is a lot of hijinks, really, in order to work around that. So, for example, I've done a fair amount of work with Makerere University in Uganda. So it's a tenth of a degree north of the equator. And I've been known to run pings to their mail server just to be able to test the behavior of a highly lossy satellite line. For a long time, they had something on the order of 30% loss on their SATCOM line, which is not a good situation. They got tired, I guess, of me pointing out that they had something they had to do. They went and bought some bandwidth, which was a good thing for them to do. And then the other thing that they did was they moved the mail server. The mail server is now in Europe. And so when I go ping their mail server, hey, Europe you can get to just fine. It's really not a problem. Their students going to the mail server, I don't know, that might not be as good. So what they often will try to do is move their servers into the bandwidth corridor here and be able to conduct business on the basis of having you have access to their website, but not in their home country, in wherever their place is. Okay, and so for Makerere, the two sites where their satellite bandwidth comes into, one of them is in Bergen, Norway, and the other one is in New York, both via Intelsat. Okay, so they're doing that. Flip side, they're busily trying to put a fiber. They have a fiber that goes to just north of Madagascar. They're trying to lay this fiber. This is the easy cable. And they're trying to lay another cable that'll go up to, I think, Dubai. Okay? And also trying to make this connect directly over to the East Indian cable, which in turn goes to Singapore. And what that'll eliminate is a satellite communications delay. It changes it from 600 milliseconds to 200 milliseconds. That's a huge difference. Makes things a lot nicer. Okay, so that's kind of how they solve that. Okay, there's also another problem though. Did you know that the entire world doesn't speak English? The language barrier is even bigger than the address barrier. And the address, or the naming that is used in domain names. I really like to see Pepsi in a domain name because I know where to get that product. Okay, well, they probably want to see it written in Arabic or in Chinese or whatever. And they're in the process of changing that to enable themselves to do that. Okay, so naming and naming of the content is also a big part of that. Now, they already have the ability to put the content in their own language, but naming it so that their people can identify it.
That would be less of a problem, don't you think?
Well, it's less of a problem for you.
Our DNS system is distributed, so having a parallel domain system whereby the Arabic translation would be here pointing to the same addresses that the, say, .com or other.
Well, that's one way to do it. The domain name system right now works all in ASCII. Okay, so and even the internationalized domain names, where they have Arabic or Chinese or whatever, it's translated into ASCII using a defined algorithm. Okay, and that limitation to ASCII winds up having a big impact.
So maybe one more quick question if anybody has it.
Yeah. So I'm wondering why is it such a tough problem to convince people to switch to IPv6, given that to many people switching to IPv6 means probably that their operating system vendors would just switch there.
Well, as far as the technology, it isn't all that hard. They may or may not like it, but they can figure out pretty quickly how to run it. The big hard thing is, so how do I run my business? How do I enable all of my people to access all of the content of all the other people that I talk with? How do I do all the things that are necessary to running a business? How do I update my software, which is all built around everything's IPv4 addresses, and switch in the ability to also have IPv6 addresses? The same concept as the Y2K thing, but without the "and it'll explode if you don't do it by this date." Okay? It's the business issues that I think are about 80% of what's behind resistance to moving forward. Would you agree with that, Will?